Hey Meissner makers, it's Jennifer. It's Wednesday, it's 1 o'clock, and we are here for a new episode of Wednesday Workshop at 1. It is getting warmer out there. We are taking a look at some easy summertime sewing projects, something to keep that creativity going, keep you inspired while you're spending sometimes a little less time inside in your sewing studio and a little bit more time outside. So today's project, or today's technique, is a disappearing four patch. So we're going to be stitching up these blocks that look like you worked really hard and spent a tremendous amount of time cutting these teeny little narrow strips and lining them up so precisely. So I'm going to show you how that's done, and you will be amazed at how fast this is. Now, this particular block, this is one of those blocks where it doesn't matter what size you start off your sections with as long as they're the same. So a disappearing four patch is a block that's created by sewing 4 blocks of fabric together. You can have 2 fabrics, a light and a dark like we have here. You can have 3 fabrics where your darks are 2 different fabrics. You can have 4 different fabrics. It really doesn't make a tremendous amount of difference. This is meant to be a scrap type quilt. Now, if you personally prefer something that is a little bit more of a formal style, then I'm going to recommend that you use some kind of a background, meaning a light and a high contrast light to dark. That will give you a little bit more of this interwoven feel throughout your quilt. And I think you'll be a little happier with it for those of you that have more of a formal style in your quilting and in your stitching. So what do we need to get started? Bare basics, some light fabrics, some dark fabrics. Now, if you happen to have a pre-cut stack at home of 5-inch squares, I would use these 5-inch squares to stitch each of my 4 patch blocks together. If you are looking for that super formal type of a look or a little more formal type of a look, I would start with a pack of 5-inch squares and then do cut a contrasting light fabric in 5-inch squares. And you could do that one of 2 ways. Either the traditional rotary cutter method, where you're simply going to cut 5-inch strips across the width of the fabric and then come back and cross cut into 5-inch squares. Or for those of you that have an AccuQuilt at home, I would use my 5-inch square die, sandwich my fabric on the die, put the mat on top, run it through that cutter, and I will have perfect consistent 5-inch squares to match or to contrast with my 5-inch pre-cut bundle. Okay? If you have, did I already mention, if you have scraps at home, you could also take your 5-inch square cutter and run through, create your own custom 5-inch square stack. It's totally up to you and what fabrics you're looking for. If you have a 10-inch set at home, take your 10-inch fabric stack out, cut it into quadrants, and now you have 5-inch stack to work with, right? So it's all about using those fabrics that you have at home that you have been stashing for just the right project. Now is the time. You're at home, you're relaxing, it's a beautiful day out, you just want to create. Get into that stash, get some of those fabrics out, and let's make a disappearing 4 patch. All right, makers, for this block, we are using our 5-inch pre-cut stack that we had in our stash. It doesn't matter what size you make your blocks, as long as all 4 of the sections, all 4 of the pieces for your 4 patch are the same size. We're using 5-inch, it could be 3, it could be 7, it could be 8, it could be 12. I probably wouldn't go any smaller than a 4, just by virtue of the fact that as you start to cut this apart and stitch it back together, it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. But experiment. You know, if you want to create something very, very tiny, give it a shot. Send me pictures, info@meissnersewing.com. I want to see what happens when you start scaling these down. Okay, so the first step is we're going to take our 2 light fabrics, we're going to put them across from each other, and our 2 contrasting or dark fabrics, put them diagonal from each other. Remember that these don't have to be the same, these don't have to be the same, but they do need to be tonally the same, meaning darks and lights. Okay, that's what's going to create that checkerboard or that woven pattern. We're going to stitch the light to the dark to the light, and then we'll stitch the top unit to the bottom unit so that we have something that looks like so. That's when the magic happens. From there, we are going to cut our 4-patch apart. We're going to cut, in this case, I cut 1.5 inches from the center line, then 1.5 inches in this direction, and this direction. So we end up with all of these little segments. From there, all we're going to do is rotate them so that they are creating that interwoven effect. And then we'll stitch together here to create the top segment, here, here, and then we'll stitch the top row to the center, the bottom row to the center, and we will end up with a block that looks like this. Are you ready? Let's stitch. Okay, so light to dark, light to dark. This is something you can very easily chain piece. Do yourself a favor if you're working with tone-on-tone fabrics and make sure and lay them down right sides up to start so that you don't get all the way through your stitching and realize that you have some of your tone-on-tones or your white-on-whites stitched the wrong way up. And the next one. If you are working with pre-cuts, a lot of them have that little wavy edge to them. Decide whether your 1/4 inch is going to be measured from the inside of that little wave or the outside. It doesn't matter as long as you are consistent. If you're using a 1/4 inch foot that has that little wall on the right hand side, then I would suggest you use the outermost portion of the teeth. Okay, so we have our first section stitched together. Honestly, it's 2 big squares. I would not bother pressing at this point. If this really bothers you, then by all means, give it a quick little press. I am going to push the seam allowances towards the dark side for no other reason than to keep that red fabric from shadowing through the white fabric at the end. Okay, we've got those edges aligned. I'm using the outermost points against the wall or guide on that presser foot to keep everything lined up. Now remember, this is summer sewing. I'm not super concerned about a lot of precision, so I really don't want to pick a project that's going to require a lot of precision. Okay. And I say that because I know when I open this up from working with pre-cuts that, you know, sometimes you end up a hair off. Okay, I'm going to blame it on pre-cuts, but sometimes it's my own cutting too. I'm not always as perfect as I'd like to be. But what's important is that I have a nice intersection here. Now I will give that just a quick press. I would suggest just pressing this down flat, sort of the way that they want to go. Hopefully that's going to be with most of the seams heading into the dark. But you will have one side where it's not going to stitch, not going to press that way. Okay, and we'll press from the right side so that we have our square. Now it's time to cut. So let me grab my rotary cutter and mat here so we can cut this up. Now there's no magic for where I'm going to make these cuts, but you do need to be consistent across the entirety of the project. I'm going to use, I think I said 1.5 inch cut. So I'm lining the ruler up right along the center seam line to make that first cut. All right, then I'm going to rotate this and I'm going to cut the same distance to the right this time of the seam allowance. And now I'm going to rotate my block so that I am cutting, all right, caution here. All right, first we cut the 1.5 inches to this side of the seam allowance. Then we cut the 1.5 inches to the opposite side of the seam allowance, that seam allowance that is running up and down through your block. We're going to do the same thing, this equal distance from your seam allowance running this direction. Now before you do that, it is going to be tempting to take your block, position your ruler, and try to stitch through. Resist that urge, okay? You want, while we're not being uber sensitive about precision, we want some precision. So I would do each section at a time, okay? So I'm going to cut, I think I said 1.5 inches away from the seam allowance, and then I will separate, remember we're just cutting 1.5 inches on each side of that center seam allowance. So let me get these cut and you can see what that looks like. Now I said 1.5 inches. I wouldn't go any smaller than 1 inch because remember you're going to lose part of this segment in your seam allowance. But you can go slightly larger if you'd like. How big or how large you make that seam allowance is totally up to you, but should be in relative, and it should have some kind of relation to the size of the squares that you started with. If you started with a square that's a little smaller, right, like our 5-inch squares are a little small, then we want a cut that's going to be a little bit more narrow. These are blocks that you'll be able to chain piece and stitch up multiples at a time, but I would recommend that the first, I would say 2 to 3 that you stitch, and more importantly that you cut, that you do them one at a time so that you get comfortable with the process and so that you notice right away if something that you're cutting or stitching isn't laid out quite right. So let's put this back together here so you can see what it looked like before I started cutting it up. Okay, so if you'll recall, we started with a light and a dark and a light and a dark. Okay, light, dark, light, dark. Then from the center, both the horizontal and the vertical seam, we cut 1.5 inches. I said 1.5 inches, but I actually cut 1 inch. We cut a consistent distance, and we'll go to the inch, from that horizontal seam line 1 inch down and 1 inch above. Then from that vertical seam line, 1 inch to the right and 1 inch to the left. So now we have 9 little segments, okay? Now we want to take the 9 segments and we're going to take the outside center segments, woo, and we're just going to flip them. Okay, just reverse their positions. There we go. You'll know that you've got this going correctly when you have dark, light, or light, dark, right? Each of the little sections should be a different tone. And then we'll do the same thing for the top center and the bottom center. Just flip their positions like so. And now we're ready to stitch the top, the center, and the bottom together. So let's do that so you can see how this will look. Now I am using a 60 weight thread. I just find that by using a slightly lighter thread weight, it doesn't take up a lot of space in my seam allowance. My blocks are a more consistent size and closer to the size that I thought they were going to be when I finished up. Now remember that the first time we go through this, we're not chain piecing. We're not worried so much about making these blocks quickly as we are worried about making them correctly. 1/4 inch seam allowance. These are all straight edges that I'm stitching together. So I am going to use, or I am using a 1/4 inch foot with a guide. Kind of like having a little bumper guard on there so I don't have to pay a tremendous amount of attention as I'm stitching. Now when you get to the center portion of the block, that's this segment here, you've got a nice little checkerboard that's happening. So while I'm not superly concerned about which direction I am positioning my seam allowances, I do want to press them so that when I join that little checkerboard section, anytime that I have seam allowances crisscrossing each other, as we do here, I'd like for them to be pressed in opposite directions so that I can nest them together. And it makes it a little easier to ensure that everything is lining up across those joins. Okay, so if all of that sounded, if you're a new quilter and that didn't quite make sense, it sounded like a foreign language, we have seam allowances pressed in one direction on this side, they're pressed in the other direction on this side, so that when we stitch this seam together, those seam allowances will nest, and it's going to be much easier to have a nice crisp corner at that intersection. Okay, one more to go here. What I liked about these blocks, well, number one, because I was starting with that same size square for everything, it was very easy to get to the stitching point. You know, the cutting point typically isn't anyone's favorite part of starting a new project. So the faster we can get to the stitching, the better. And when we can create something that looks very intricate, that really is relatively easy, relatively fast, you know, that's always a bonus in my book too. And these particular blocks, they work beautifully, of course, to put together for a quilt, but it's also something that you could use as a pillow top, could use it as a wall hanging. When we go back and look at some of the different layout variations that we have, you see it's also something where you could create a large quilt very quickly, or something that could be used as a table topper, or run long and narrow as a table runner. Okay, so here are the three sections. Right, whoops, there they go. We have our top, center, and bottom, and so now we'll stitch across this way and across this way to complete the block. Today I am sewing with our Janome 3160 QDC. This is an amazing machine for those of you who are either, you know, getting a little bit more involved in quilting and sewing. For those of you that are going to start taking classes again with us, if you do travel and stitch, if you're looking for something lightweight to put out in the patio or the pool area at home, okay, we want those seam allowances nesting. And speaking of Janome brand machines, you'll want to reach out to either us here at info, I-N-F-O, at meissnersewing.com, or call your nearest location. There are some new Janome long arm model machines that are coming soon, depending on when you're watching this particular video, sooner or sooner. Okay, so we have the top and the center stitched together. It is now time to stitch that last segment. And I'm going to pay closer attention to which way it aligns. The first time I've stitched this block, I want to make sure the first one is done correctly. Now, we're always super interested in what you are stitching at home. We'd love to see pictures of your projects. We'd love for you to bring them by and show them to us. We're as excited as you are when you finish up a project. Now, if you are doing this at home and this were a real project, I would suggest that before you sew that top and that center section together, that you take it to the ironing board and press your seam allowances so that they'll nest when you sew those last cross seams together. Everything will lay much flatter. If you are stitching this using a chain piecing method, then I would recommend for this particular block that you press all of your seams open rather than trying to figure out which side to press them. Okay, so I'm going to give it a quick little press here with my mini iron in the privacy of my own studio at home. Once I had all of these blocks done, because they have a little bit of bulk in the center, I would be inclined to take it over to my Singer press and give them a good crisp press so that the bulk where we have multiple fabrics coming together here in the center will be nice and flat, okay, which you'll appreciate for your finished projects. All right, makers, let's take one last look at these blocks and some different variations and arrangements for putting together your final project. Okay, makers. So I know that as you look at these blocks, I know as I looked at those blocks, I'm like, okay, well, how am I going to lay them out? You know, am I going to be super picky about which colors go next to what? And that's one of those things that's going to be dependent on your sense of style and also what you're going to do with the finished project. So I've been thinking about doing a table covering for my deck area. And as I'm looking at this, I really do like just laying them out so that these little narrow guys are creating this little jog, right? Almost like a little garden path. But then I found that I also really liked it when instead of having these strong colorways coming here on the diagonal, and then you've got sort of another four patch forming here, I also really liked the effect that I got when I turned my blocks this way. Okay, now you still have that four patch happening, but you have the light and the dark effects that are happening versus this diagonal. The other thing that I thought would be really interesting is taking that approach where we have the lights all coming together in one section and letting this be a block that's then sashed out with another fabric on the in-between. And I would do this in particular if your quilt top is really scrappy or your piece is really scrappy and you need something to tie it all together. Then by using one fabric consistently for a sashing throughout and considering this to be your block, it's going to be a little easier to tie everything together. The other thing that I like about this layout, now that's whether I'm going to sash it or whether I'm going to stitch them together like so, is that this gives me a nice area to concentrate on practicing some of my what I would call fancy pants quilting or some of my ruler work designs where I want to create something that's a little bit more intricate. As a hint for you, if you're a newer quilter, the dark sections of the fabric are going to be more forgiving in terms of any less than 100% perfect stitching that you may have. It's going to show a little more on the white than it will here. The other thing that these very large open areas lend themselves well to is for those of you that have higher end machines that have some onboard digitizing, this is a great place to play with some of those IQ Designer or My Design Center stitch fills to do your quilting for you automatically. Because remember, this time of year, we want to be outside enjoying that sunshine as much as is possible. So using all those tips and tricks at our disposal is going to help get those projects done a little bit faster for us. Hope you've enjoyed today's segment of Wednesday Workshop at 1. If you have questions, comments, need some tips on your summer sewing projects, then go ahead and email us at info@meissnersewing.com, and we will see you next week.